free them while she was still alive. But with few exceptions...
I wonder my battery keeps running down. Okay, so I want to go back through part of what we just heard. Specifically, I want to look at the presidency of George Washington. His 2 terms are going to be important, as I was saying, because it sets a blueprint for a lot of what's going to come later. So these terms, some of them should look familiar based on what you just heard. We'll revisit a couple of the topics that were laid out in the crash courses. Washington's 2 terms as president, right after he's unanimously selected, are going to be difficult. Perhaps he's the only figure in the minds of some that could have kind of navigated a way in between some of these difficulties. Now, we've seen already some of the early challenges that this very young nation is having. And so the fact that he's this really, really popular figure may have made it possible for him to kind of navigate through difficult seas. So Washington is going to be president for 2 terms, right, from 1789 to 1797. And those 2 terms are going to be really important, although difficult. Some think that the stability of the young republic itself may depend on Washington's ability to lead, right? That we are not going to make it, perhaps, if he fails. We don't have a blueprint yet. We're new, so I think everything is more heightened in that sense. Some are questioning how committed people are to the new nation, right? Say if you're elite, you're wealthy, are you committed to a nation even if it hurts you in the pocketbook? Right? Or if you're not wealthy, as we saw with the rebellion earlier, how much are you going to be willing to sort of take it on the chin for the nation to get up and move it? These are questions that I think can only be answered by being answered, right? By kind of working through the history. Washington is going to see factions develop in his own administration, even though this is not what he wants. You kind of heard mentioned there that he's concerned that the idea of political parties itself could tear the nation apart. So he's not in favor of having separate political parties. Yet this is what's going to develop, whether he kind of likes it or not. These factions had really developed, as we sort of discussed, during the constitutional debates, right? People had already kind of set up separate ideological camps. So some think that Washington's main goal may be to bring together these Federalists and these Anti-Federalists in his new government. Technically, Washington is not a Federalist. He's sort of separate, right? But he is going to support a number of policies that Alexander Hamilton, one of the more prominent Federalists, put forth. So many kind of view him as closer to that. But he does not feel like separate parties are good for the nation. So how is he going to manage this? What's his administration going to look like? Well, we can kind of scope it out through some of the main figures involved. George Washington's vice president is John Adams. His secretary of the Treasury is going to be Alexander Hamilton. And his secretary of state was Thomas Jefferson. So these are all 3 names we know. Obviously, they're historically significant. Now, part of what's significant about this group of 3 is that John Adams and Alexander Hamilton are both Federalists. Right? So their perspective is federalism, or sort of top-down central government as good for the nation. But we also know that Thomas Jefferson is kind of the leader of the Anti-Federalists. So how are they going to work together? Right? When they have competing visions, how are they going to work together? This is one of the early questions that's going to have to be answered. Jefferson, especially because he's an Anti-Federalist, later, Democratic Republican will be the title that's often used for them. In many ways, these divisions in Washington's own administration kind of reflect larger divisions in the young nation. We've already seen some of these divisions playing out, again, in the case of Shays' Rebellion. So are you in favor of farmers or merchants? Or do you think that the future of the nation is in towns and cities, or do you think it's on the small farm, right? Answering those questions really kind of help put you into one camp or the other, perhaps. So what are some of these broader tensions and how are they going to play out? Well, we see a lot of them play out with the policies that the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, are going to put forth. Right? A lot of these policies, I think, translate into or at least a lot of his vision will translate into certain policies. So as you heard, one of the first things Hamilton feels we need to do is to make some arrangements for the assumption of the debt. What do we do with our debt now that we're a new nation? Right? When we were a colony, we didn't necessarily have to worry about that. That was England's job. Now, it's our job. And Hamilton is going to be one of those that's very instrumental in this. Makes sense. He's Secretary of the Treasury. Of course, he's going to be central to kind of economic policy and the economic future. So he wants to put the new nation on a sound financial footing. He feels like if we're not respected, right, then we can't be an independent nation. I'm not sure if Hamilton was a Game of Thrones fan or not, but he said that the Lannisters always pay their debts. Right? The Lannisters always pay their debts because part of your reputation is paying your debts. So if America doesn't pay its debts, how can we be respected as an independent nation? We might as well go back to being a colony. So how are we going to do that? Well, during the Revolution, both the states and the Continental Congress had issued lots of IOUs. Right? Lots of IOUs. Remember, they didn't have the proper revenue. So these IOUs, loan certificates, etc., will be used, especially, for example, to pay soldiers when they didn't have the cash. Right? Now that the war is over, many people are left holding these IOUs, right, and wanting to cash them in, wanting to get paid in the way that they were supposed to. But many of them are not sure they're ever going to see their money. I think about Shays, think about some of what you saw with those soldiers wallpapering their homes with money that seems to be worthless at this point. A lot of folks feel like they're never going to see that money. Well, Hamilton felt like it was important for the nation to assume those debts, right? Assumption of the debt. You got to assume those debts. It would signal to European countries that we were serious, that we were solvent, that we were a real nation. So he says we got to find a way to do that and do it quickly. So this is going to be one of the first issues of the new administration, this assumption of the debt. His plan was to exchange these IOUs, right, exchange them for Treasury-issued bonds. Right, Treasury-issued bonds. So you exchange IOUs for kind of government bonds, which will mature and then eventually pay out. Right. So this could be doubly significant because it's getting people invested in the nation in a literal way. Right. You're literally holding something that comes from the Treasury Department. It comes from the federal government. You literally are invested in the success of the country. So this seems like a good solution from the perspective of Hamilton and others. But there are going to be some that will oppose this plan. James Madison is going to be one that opposes this plan. Madison, then a member of Congress, is like, no, this is not good for a couple of reasons. Number one, first and foremost, he thought that some states had already kind of tightened their belts, right? Had already kind of hunkered down, had paid their debts. So this particular plan seemed to reward those states that were procrastinating, right? Those states that hadn't kind of bit the bullet and dealt with this issue were being rewarded, kind of bailed out. Madison did not feel like this was fair in a sense. Secondly, many soldiers and small farmers, think Daniel Shades, right, who had hit hard times, had already sold their IOUs off to wealthier land speculators, anyone with money. So imagine some guy comes into Western Massachusetts and sees Daniel Shades and his neighbors struggling, right? This guy's a wealthy land speculator. He's like, hey, I heard you got $1,000 in IOUs. Like, yeah, I need to get the money, right? It's $1,000, but it's not worth anything to me. It's an IOU. It's only worth something when they pay it. So this land speculator says, you know what? Tell you what, I'll take them off your hands. And Daniel Shades, let's say, was like, oh man, that's fantastic. I'll be able to pay my mortgage. I won't lose my house. This is great. And so he's like, oh, here you go. It's $1,000. And the speculator's like, whoa. Right? That's $1,000 in IOUs, but right now it's worthless. So tell you what. I'll give you $20 for it. 20 bucks? I just told you it's worth $1,000. No, actually, it's worth nothing until somebody pays it. Right? So okay, $25. Right? Take it or leave it. Right? So you got a choice, right? So many of these small farmers that are struggling had already sold this off, and so these wealthy speculators can eventually cash this in for big money. So Madison is like, is that fair? Is this rewarding the people that you actually wanted to reward, or is it rewarding the wealthy? So Madison is like, this is another reason why this plan seemed not to be the best plan from his perspective. You're already seeing a couple of divisions, I would argue, develop in the society itself, right? Wealthy versus poor, working class, North versus South is already in this conversation, whether we know it or not as well. Town and city versus farmer, or more rural areas are already involved in this. So many of these speculators, again, were buying up these IOUs. They're buying up Western lands really cheaply, and some feel like this is not necessarily fair. This is not necessarily the American way that's developing. So Hamilton's proposal for assuming the debt is initially defeated in the House of Representatives, right? There's too many enemies, it's not going to get through. So what do? Compromise. As we saw, an important deal will be made in order to get this plan. In order to get some key Virginia congressmen to switch their votes. Madison was from Virginia. Alexander Hamilton is actually from New York. Right? So again, think already about how North and South are kind of looking at each other almost as two separate imagined communities. Maybe they have different interests. Maybe they have different motivations. You could argue, even from the beginning. So in order to get a couple of key Virginia congressmen to switch votes, the administration promises to support a move of the federal capital to Northern Virginia. Right? So the capital will be Washington, D.C. eventually, right? Which is technically in the South, right? Not New York, not Philadelphia, but more towards the South. So if you're a Southern congressman, this seems like a good deal. Right? You essentially move the capital, the center of power, to your region. Right? A new vote will be taken after this, and the assumption plan will be passed. So once again, think about how politicians often will use compromise to try to achieve what they want, to try to give both sides something they can live with at least. So this is one issue that will come up under Washington and under his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The second economic issue is one involving the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the U.S. becomes an issue. Now, again, I think this kind of illustrates not just economic policies, but how they imagine this new community, how they imagine the new nation looking. Hamilton wanted to establish a national Bank of the United States that was kind of patterned on the Bank of England. Right? It's like one strong central economic, foundation, essentially. Right? In some ways, it's symbolically important. We're a new nation now. We need a national bank, he will argue. Now, technically, it's going to be a private institution funded in part by the federal government. So, federal government putting money into this technically private institution. And again, it's similar in some ways to the Central Bank of England. And Hamilton and others feel like this will help facilitate trade. That it's going to help make us a kind of big boy nation, give us a central currency, even in the ability to sort of distribute that currency, perhaps. It will serve as the main depository in the new United States. But James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, remember, they're always concerned about too much federal power. So having a central bank of the U.S. that the federal government is kind of in bed with, for lack of a better term, to them seemed a little bit not so good. Right? So they will come out against this. They will see the bank as unconstitutional, right? As an unconstitutional extension of federal power, an unconstitutional extension of federal power. They will argue, look, the Constitution does not give Congress the authority to charter such a bank. Jefferson would say, look, hold up a copy of the Constitution. Show me where it says you can have a Bank of the United States. Right? And Hamilton is like, well, show me where it says you can't have a Bank of the United States. Part of what this is illustrating is that they have different interpretations of the Constitution itself. Can you only do things that are written in the Constitution, or can you do anything that's not prohibited in the Constitution? So the Constitution is going to always involve interpretation, as we know, right? Usually the Supreme Court becomes the one that has to think about that interpretation in terms of how this is going to play out, right? Our separation of powers and such. So this Bank of the U.S. is really a kind of larger issue about the future of the nation itself, and I think it shows that both Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or as those Anti-Federalists are already calling themselves, Democratic Republicans or Republicans, the names get a little complicated, but think two parties. Right? Both sides feel like they're patriotic, both sides feel like they're good Americans, both sides feel like they have the best vision for the future of the nation. I would argue that both major parties today feel like they have the best vision for the nation. It's one of the reasons it makes it so difficult for them to have conversations quite often, is they both feel like they're right. often difficult to negotiate things with folks when they both feel like they're right. So this Bank of the U.S., how is it going to play out? Does the Constitution give Congress authority? Does it not give Congress authority? In some ways, it also shows that some folks are already concerned about Alexander Hamilton as well. Hamilton is very powerful, very powerful. Many said he definitely would have been president if he could have been. He could not because he was born in the Caribbean, born in the British West Indies. But he's going to be essentially the most powerful Federalist after Washington leaves office. So some feel like he is bent on creating a tyranny. Maybe it's a tyranny of the North over the South. Maybe it's a tyranny of business over the farmers. But they feel like he's up to something, right? Feel like he's up to something. Well, Hamilton initially wins the debate in Congress, and eventually the Supreme Court decides that you can have a Bank of the United States, that it was in fact constitutional. But many in the public are becoming concerned about this federal power, right? Maybe there is too much tyranny at the top, right? That there is there's too much federal power at the expense of the states or at the expense of individual rights. One textbook that I used to use said, quote, "The general public looked on Hamilton's actions with growing fear and hostility. Many persons associated huge national debts and privileged banks with the decay of public virtue," right? So when you're in debt, could you be virtuous? Could you really be independent in that sense? Or really were you moving back to a position more akin to slavery? So there are some red flags perhaps already, right? Some red flags already. There's another issue, this report on manufacturers. I don't need to say too much about it. Essentially what's happening is Hamilton's vision for the future of the nation is that we will ultimately be a nation of merchants, a nation of business. Hamilton didn't feel like the future was on the farm. Jefferson feels like the quintessential American is the small farmer. Hamilton doesn't really hold that vision. Now, maybe it has something to do with their backgrounds. Jefferson's from Virginia, Hamilton lives in New York. Maybe it has something to do with that, but they have different visions, and I think these competing visions will play themselves out. So this report on manufacturers, briefly, in 1792, Hamilton, according to many, kind of suffers his first major setback. He had recommended that the federal government get more involved in economic policy, that the government has more of its hands in the economy, mainly to stimulate manufacturing. He feels like manufacturing is the future of the nation. But many in Congress feel like such a policy would favor northern cities over southern farmers. So there's kind of a backlash against it. Jefferson in particular, right, is like, wait a second. Jefferson, in fact, has a certain suspicion about Americans living in towns and cities. Jefferson thought that if we did become a nation of towns and cities, it could be bad, right, for the Republic. It could be bad for the Republic. Jefferson wrote, quote, "I think our government will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as the people are chiefly agricultural. As long as we're chiefly agricultural, we will remain virtuous." He says, "When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt, as in Europe." So he's like, look, as long as you're on the farm, you're good. Why? Because farmers are independent, right? You have your own land, you can grow your own food and sell it, right? You're essentially not beholden to anyone else. What happens when you work in a factory? Right? Some will argue, and some will already start using the term wage slave. You go to work, you got to punch in, right? You got to do what your boss says. But what if your boss comes in and says, "Hey, I need you to vote Federalist in the next election"? "Oh, no, I was thinking about going with the Democratic Republican candidate." Well, I think you really want to think about voting Federalist. In fact, only people employed here are those that vote Federalist. Jefferson say, see, right, you're beholden to someone else because you're not independent. Right? You work for someone else. So they have two different visions, right? They have two different visions of the future, and I think this north-south, this kind of urban-rural, elite, all these differences, I think, remain important throughout. This urban-rural tension is going to remain an important theme, of course, in our history up through the 20th century at least. Now, we are mostly an agricultural nation at this point. Like I said before, it's not until 1920 that you'll have more Americans living in towns than live on the farm. It's not until 1920. It's a 20th century thing where it tips and we become urban in that sense. But we are already seeing a move in that direction. We are already seeing towns and cities grow and develop. Ultimately, this report on manufacturers will be rejected by Congress. So Congress is like, no thanks, right? Alexander Hamilton kind of takes a loss on that one. We still debate how much government should be involved in the economy, right? Especially when we feel like it might cross the line into socialism or communism or other forms of government, which we have more of a laissez-faire economy in the minds of many. So all of these issues are sort of up for debate, and Washington is trying to manage all of them. He's trying to manage all these personalities. He has a very difficult job. On top of that, he now has to worry about foreign policy, right? Washington now has to do the things that presidents do for independent nations, right? He has to figure out what's our relationship going to be like with England. What's our relationship going to be like with France? England is formerly the mother country, right? Obviously, there are probably going to be some hurt feelings, right? Because we put that whooping on them in the Revolution. But also, England and France don't get along. So every time they're fighting, we are going to get pulled in one direction or another. So how do you sort of work this out? Especially during Washington's second term, right after 1793. This is actually a mistake. His farewell address should say 1796. But in Washington's second term, from 1793 to 1797 or so, foreign policy really becomes an issue for some of the reasons you heard. The French Revolution, of course, is raging by this point, and after 1793, the French Revolution especially has sort of devolved into this reign of terror, right? Several thousand people get guillotined, that kind of stuff. And so many are concerned about our relationship with France and how close we should be to France at this point, especially when war between England and France escalates. We're going to get pulled in different directions, right? The Federalists, as you heard, tended to think that we should be closer to England in our relationships. Right? We have a cultural connection, a political connection, a history. We speak English. So many of the Federalists say we should be closest to England. Whereas many of the anti-Federalists, like Jefferson himself, feels like we should be closer to the French. Right? The French had helped us during the war. They've been our ally. We still have a treaty with them at this time. Many admire French culture, so maybe we should be closer to them. Right? So this is a complicated time, and Washington's going to have to kind of walk carefully through this. Although some would start to say this French Revolution is maybe a point where we need to cut our losses and distance ourselves from the French. So Washington and others will immediately pursue a policy of neutrality. A policy of neutrality. What does neutrality mean? Well, we're trying to stay out of it. Right? We try to stay out of it, especially when there's tensions in Europe, or tensions specifically between England and France. We want to be neutral. So we just kind of announce our neutrality. Now, as you may know, it's often difficult to remain neutral in a situation where people are fighting. Maybe you have a circle of friends. Two of those friends are not getting along. What happens? You start getting text messages. You start getting phone calls. You think I'm right, right? I don't know. You guys work that out, right? Oh, you're on his side. Right? You're on her side. Right? If you don't come out strong enough, it seems like you're on the other side. The same thing is going to happen, I would argue, in terms of conflicts with England and France and our position in relation to it. So how are we going to be neutral? How is this going to be possible, even if Washington wants to do that? It will be difficult. Right? It will be difficult. You have many people that are concerned with spies and foreign intrigue and all these stories that are passing around, especially when things get bad between England and France and we get pulled into it. As you heard, Washington sent an advisor to England to negotiate a treaty because things start to get tense between us and the British. And he doesn't just send some low-level advisor. He sends John Jay. John Jay was Supreme Court Justice. He's going to send a Supreme Court Justice to England to negotiate a neutrality treaty with England. After the English were starting to do things that we feel like violates our independence. What are the English doing? They've started a policy of seizing American trading vessels. They're snatching our ships. And this is, in the minds of many, maybe an act of war. Right? Maybe it's time to go to war again. If you can't maintain your own independence or sovereignty, then perhaps we need to take up arms once again, some will argue. So we send John Jay, and Jay will negotiate a treaty. He's probably pretty pleased with himself because he negotiates a treaty. But when he comes back with this word of this treaty, it's very unpopular here in the U.S. It's very unpopular, Jay's Treaty, as it will be called. It seemed like the Americans had given up too much. We kind of feel like we're being treated as a stepchild. We feel like we're being treated as we're not a real nation, right? That they're still treating us like children. And so many Americans are concerned. When the Senate ratified a modified version of the treaty in 1795, there was actually protests among Americans about the treaty. For a brief time, it actually looked like civil war might result. People might really be upset enough to take it to that point. Now, many argue that only because George Washington himself remains so incredibly popular that the tensions will kind of calm down, right? There were a couple of opportunities where this kind of critical period could become especially critical. There were plots by certain generals to perhaps take over the government, right? There was actually one meeting where folks report coming into a room and they're like, you know what, let's take over this and that. We control the army, blah, blah, blah. And then several of them are like, we can't do that to George Washington. Right? That's how powerful Washington's kind of stature was, that it may even have kind of warded off treason in these early years. Again, because he's so popular, tensions kind of calm down. Folks do not take it to the point of civil war. But what do we know for sure? We know that there are divisions in the country. We know that we have a permanent two-party system at this point. The parties may change over time, but we are going to have at least two major parties from here on out. So Washington has had two very difficult terms, despite the fact that he's, unanimously selected, incredibly popular, and all of that. And Washington decides not to run for a third term. He decides not to run for a third term. This is going to be a really important decision because he did not have to do that. Right? He did not have to kind of walk away from power. Think about how rare that is in world history for someone to just say, you know what, I'm good. You can have it. Right? Power can become intoxicating. There were some that wanted Washington to be king, to be president for life. Right? So the fact that he's going to make these decisions and set an important precedent as president is really, really important. And he walks away after this second term. He wants to go back and be a farmer. Right? He wants to go back to Virginia. He decides against running for a third term, setting a precedent that's going to last until 1940. It lasts well into the 20th century. As you know, Roosevelt will be elected for more than two terms. Right? He's elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. He would have been elected probably again had he not died at the end of World War II. And then we will change the Constitution, so now you can only have two terms to kind of formalize this precedent that Washington set. So he doesn't have to walk away, right? But he does walk away, and this perhaps is really, really important as a precedent. As he walks away, he's also going to make a farewell address. In about 1796, he makes this farewell address. He's going to basically write a letter to the nation, and he's going to try to warn us about some things that he sees as problematic as he's leaving. He's like, look, you might want to keep an eye on this as he leaves. So in his famous farewell address to the nation, he will warn against an emerging partisanship. He warns us about parties, perhaps political parties tearing apart the nation. But be careful with this. He'd always kind of been nervous about it, and this is going to be even more the case as he leaves. He also will warn against the U.S. becoming involved in foreign affairs, becoming too entangled in foreign affairs. He wants the nation to be isolated. He wants the nation to remain neutral and be isolated from most of the rest of the world. He kind of alludes at one point to the fact that we have a natural border in the Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe. And he's like, we should use it. It's 3,000 miles away. Europe is always involved in some foolishness. They're always fighting each other. We don't have to be involved, and we should not. Use that natural barrier. And we will essentially follow much of that for a while. For a while, we will pursue a course of isolationism, but something is going to change and tip in our history. We'll see when that starts to happen as we move forward. So his isolationist view on American involvement abroad will really be an important component of our foreign policy throughout the 19th century. Of course, that's going to change in the 20th. So he walks away from power. Well, who's going to be in charge now? Well, George Washington will be succeeded by his vice president. Who's his vice president? John Adams. John Adams is a Federalist, and John Adams will be second president of the United States. Now, John Adams may have been behind the eight ball, right? To be coming after somebody so popular, somebody who had led us through the war and through the earliest years of the nation. Maybe John Adams was destined to fail in a sense, but there are also going to be some other challenges that Adams is going to have to deal with. John Adams was vice president to Washington. He now becomes president. Now, John Adams's vice president was Thomas Jefferson, even though Jefferson and Adams were political opposites. Adams is a prominent Federalist. Jefferson is one of the most prominent anti-Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Well, how could this happen? Well, the way the Constitution was originally written, whoever got the second most votes in the Electoral College. Right? So you have an election, whoever gets the second most votes is vice president. That's the way it was originally written. Regardless of your political affiliation, whoever got the second most votes would be vice president. Now, in 1804, the Constitution will be amended to make candidates for president and vice president run on the same ticket. Now, why? Because of this. Imagine in the last election if Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had to. Imagine if they're living in the White House together, hanging out. Right? How's that going to go? How are those meetings going to go? Probably not too well. They don't like each other so much. So think of in similar ways about Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They are not getting along. Sometimes they're not even on speaking terms. And so this is going to be difficult. And somebody's going to have the intelligence to say, you know what, we gotta figure something else out. This is probably not the best way to do things. So during Adams' administration, foreign policy issues, right, that as we saw under Washington were already a problem, are going to remain a problem. And Adams has his own issues to deal with, even within his own administration. Right, this is going to be an incredibly difficult time. Perhaps he's behind the eight ball to begin with. Right. On top of that, Adams does not have the personality or the prestige of Washington. Right? He's not unanimously selected. He's not the person that had led us through the war and all of that, father of the country. So this is going to be incredibly difficult. Even within Adams' own administration, many people saw Alexander Hamilton as the real leader of the party. But Hamilton can't be president. Right? So you got this guy behind you that's probably more popular than you. Some see him as the true leader, but he can't be president. So maybe you see him as undermining you in a sense. Plus, you got Thomas Jefferson across the way of the other party who doesn't like you either. Right? So Adams has a rough time. Right? Has a rough time. As war in Europe continues, Adams tries to maintain Washington's commitment to neutrality. He will send diplomats to France to try to work out some of the tensions that are boiling up between us and the French. As you kind of heard, several things have happened, and our relationship with the French is becoming a bit strained. Now, even before we're really allowed to kind of sit down and negotiate with the French will demand excessive bribes. And demand excessive bribes even for the American diplomats to kind of sit down and have a conversation. And I think it sort of takes us by surprise. We feel insulted. Like, wait a second, what do you mean we got to pay you just to talk to you? This sounds, again, like we're being treated like a child. Right? And so this becomes known as that XYZ affair that they mentioned. Right? The XYZ, because in letters written back home and the correspondence and such, those that demanded the bribes are referred to anonymously as X, Y, and Z. They don't use their names. But these letters ultimately will get published back here. Imagine the TMZ at the time publishing a letter saying, we're not even going to talk to you until you pay us. The American people are outraged. We're insulted. We thought we were allies. We thought we were equals. And so some will start to question the loyalty of those that remain too loyal to the French. Even Jefferson has to kind of take a step back, perhaps. Now, Adams himself, perhaps because he feels so attacked from outside and from within, will make a couple of important decisions here that have gone down as being important. Right? Adams, perhaps not to justify it, but perhaps because he feels threatened, will do certain things. 2 sets of laws will be passed, and many people see this as Adams trying to silence his political opponents, his political opposition. 2 sets of laws. These will be the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts and Sedition Acts in 1798. Well, what do the Alien and Sedition Acts do? Well, the Alien Act allowed the president during wartime, so they allow the president during wartime to deport foreigners, kick foreigners out of the country without any kind of trial or proceeding. So you can kick foreigners out of the country without any kind of trial or proceeding, no due process. Right? Now, because the U.S. was not officially at war at the time, Adams did not exercise this power, but it's on books. Right? The Alien Acts also imposed a 14-year probation period, a 14-year probation before new immigrants could vote. Well, why would he do that? Well, many argue that the Federalists felt like most new immigrants at the time were supporters of Jefferson and his party. So that this might be a political move to make them have to wait 14 years before being able to vote. It's specifically then aimed at these recent immigrants like the Irish, the Scots-Irish, that tended to vote for Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. So this is the Alien Act. This is the Alien Act. Now, some say the Sedition Act is even more troubling. The Sedition Act, in the minds of many, might be even more threatening or more troubling. Well, what is the Sedition Act? It made it a crime to criticize the federal government. It made it a crime to criticize the federal government, punishable by a fine or even time in prison. There were people actually prosecuted in federal courts under this law. You saw the example of Matthew Lyon, the congressman, right, who criticizes the federal government and gets thrown in jail. Right, there were actually people prosecuted under this, despite its clear violation of the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, assembly, all of that. So some see this as problematic and maybe a dangerous template for the way the law might be used later. So Adams' administration is troubled in many senses. He will have 1 term. He will not have 2 terms. So then you have an election of 1800, which is where we end. Some people see this as kind of a revolution of 1800, and we'll talk more about why that's going to be the case next time. In the election of 1800, no candidate wins a majority in the Electoral College. So, who's going to win? Right, no candidate wins a majority in the Electoral College. Who's running? Well, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr each received 73 electoral votes. Now, quick math, we're going to have 4 candidates that are separated by 9 votes. Right? Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr get 73 votes. The current president, John Adams, gets 65 votes. And another Federalist by the name of Charles Pinckney got 64 votes. So you got 4 guys with a lot of support, separated by about 9 electoral votes. Well, when no candidate gets a majority of electoral votes, the Constitution says that the House of Representatives will decide the election. And so the House is supposed to decide the election. Next time this will happen will be 1824, and we'll talk about that. Well, who is the House going to choose? Are they going to choose the current president? You might expect that. Right? But they do not. The House will ultimately vote for Thomas Jefferson. So imagine how angry some folks are going to be, because they might have wanted somebody else. They might have favored someone else. So Jefferson will be selected. Now the big question is, will there be a peaceful transition of power from one political party to another? Federalists had been in charge. Now the Democratic Republicans are about to take the White House. But Adams and Jefferson don't even like each other. There are some thoughts that when Jefferson shows up and knocks on the door, Adams might not let him in, right? That they might, this might be civil war. This might be civil war. We're going to have to see how it turns out in this election of 1800 next time, because it's going to be an important template for